Guillaume Du Fay, also Dufay, Fayt, the 5th of August, c. 1397 to 27 November 1474, was a Franco-Flemish composer of the early Renaissance, the central figure in the Burgundian School. He was regarded by his contemporaries as the leading composer in Europe in the mid-15th century. Early life. For the evidence of his will, he was probably born in Beersel, in the vicinity of Brussels, the illegitimate child of an unknown priest and a woman named Marie du Fayt. She moved with her son to Cambrai early in his life, staying with a relative who was a canon of the cathedral there. His musical gifts were noticed by the cathedral authorities, who evidently gave him a thorough training in music. He studied with Roger de Hesdin during the summer of 1409, and he was listed as a choir boy in the cathedral from 1409 to 12. During those years he studied with Nicolas Malin, and the authorities must have been impressed with the boy's gifts because they gave him his own copy of Vildier's Doctrinale in 1411, a highly unusual event for one so young. In June 1414, aged around 16, he had already been given a benefice as chaplain at St. Georges, immediately adjacent to Cambrai. Later that year, on the evidence of music composed, and a later relationship with the Malatesta court, members of which he met on the trip, he probably went to the Council of Constance. He likely stayed there until 1418, at which time he returned to Cambrai. From Cambrai to Italy and Savoy from November 1418 to 1420 he was a subdeacon at Cambrai Cathedral. In 1420 he left Cambrai again, this time going to Italy, first to Rimini and then possibly Pesaro, where he worked for the Malatesta family. Although no records survive of his employment there, several compositions of his can be dated to this period. They contain references that make a residence in Italy reasonably certain. He met the composers Hugo and Arnold de Lantens, who were among the musicians of the Malatesta household. In 1424 Du Fay again returned to Cambrai, this time because of the illness and subsequent death of the relative with whom his mother was staying. By 1426, however, he had gone back to Italy, this time to Bologna, where he entered the service of Cardinal Louis Aylman, the papal legate. While in Bologna he became a deacon, and by 1428 he was a priest. Cardinal Aylman was driven from Bologna by the rival Caindoli family in 1428, and Du Fay also left at this time, going to Rome. He became a member of the papal choir, the single most prestigious musical establishment in Europe, serving first Pope Martin V, and then after the death of Pope Martin in 1431, Pope Eugene IV. By this time his fame had spread, and he had become one of the most respected musicians in Europe, and as a consequence honors in the form of benefices came to him from churches in his homeland. In 1434 he was appointed Maestro de Chapelle in Savoy, where he served Duque Equute. Evidently he left Rome because of a crisis in the finances of the papal choir, and to escape the turbulence and uncertainty during the struggle between the papacy and the Council of Basel. Yet in 1435 he was again in the service of the papal chapel, but this time it was in Florence, Pope Eugene having been driven from Rome in 1434 by the establishment of an insurrectionary republic there, sympathetic to the Council of Basel and the Concilia movement. In 1436 Du Fay composed the festive motet Nuperosarum Flores, one of his most famous compositions, dedicated to and performed at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, featuring Filippo Brunelleschi's renowned dome. Eugene at this time lived in exile at the nearby church of Santa Maria Novella. During this period Du Fay also began his long association with the Este family in Ferrara. some of the most important musical patrons of the Renaissance, and with which he probably had become acquainted during the days of his association with the Malatesta family. Rimini and Ferrara are not only geographically close, but the two families were related by marriage, and Dufay composed at least one ballad for Niccolo III, Marquis of Ferrara. In 1437 Dufay visited the town. When Niccolo died in 1441, the next Marquis maintained the contact with Dufay, and not only continued financial support for the composer but copied and distributed some of his music. Return to Cambrai. The struggle between the papacy and the Council of Basel continued through the 1430s, and evidently Dufay realized that his own position might be threatened by the spreading conflict, especially since Pope Eugene was deposed in 1439 by the council and replaced by Duke Equite of Savoy himself as Pope Felix V. At this time Dufay returned to his homeland, arriving in Cambrai by December of that year. In order to be a canon at Cambrai, he needed a law degree, which he obtained in 1437. He may have studied at University of Turin in 1436. One of the first documents mentioning him in Cambrai is dated 27 December 1440, when he received a delivery of 36 lots of wine for the feast of St. John the Evangelist. Dufay was to remain in Cambrai through the 1440s, and during this time he was also in the service of the Duke of Burgundy. While in Cambrai he collaborated with Nicolas Grenon on a complete revision of the liturgical musical collection of the cathedral, which included writing an extensive collection of polyphonic music for services. In addition to his musical work, he was active in the general administration of the cathedral. In 1444 his mother Marie died, and was buried in the cathedral, and in 1445 Dufay moved into the house of the previous canon, which was to remain his primary residence for the rest of his life. Travels to Savoy and Italy. After the abdication of the last anti-pope in 1449, his own former employer Duke Equite of Savoy, the struggle between different factions within the church began to heal, and Dufay once again left Cambrai for Point-Saint. He went to Turin in 1450, shortly before the death of Duke Equite, but returned to Cambrai later that year, and in 1452 he went back to Savoy yet again. This time he did not return to Cambrai for 6 years, and during that time he attempted to find either a benefice or an employment which would allow him to stay in Italy. Numerous compositions, including one of the 4 Lamentations that he composed on the fall of Constantinople in 1453, his famous Mass based on Shela Fayt Pale, as well as a letter to Lorenzo de' Medici, survived from this period, but as he was unable to find a satisfactory position for his retirement, he returned north in 1458. While in Savoy he served more or less officially as choirmaster for Louis, Duke of Savoy, but he was more likely in a ceremonial role, since the records of the chapel never mention him. Final years in Cambrai. When he returned to Cambrai for his final years, he was appointed canon of the cathedral. He was now the most renowned composer in Europe. Once again he established close ties to the court of Burgundy, and continued to compose music for them. In addition he received many visitors, including Busnoy, Occam, Tintoris, and Loiset Compere, all of whom were decisive in the development of the polyphonic style of the next generation. During this period he probably wrote his Mass based on L'Homme Armé, as well as the chanson on the same song. The latter composition may have been inspired by Philip the Good's call for a new crusade against the Turks, who had recently captured Constantinople. He also wrote a Requiem Mass around 1460, which is lost. After an illness of several weeks, Du Fay died on the 27th of November 1474. He had requested that his motet Avenue Regina Salorum be sung for him as he died, with Pleas for Mercy interpolated between verses of the antiphon, but time was insufficient for this to be arranged. Du Fay was buried in the chapel of St. Etienne in the Cathedral of Cambrai. His portrait was carved onto his tombstone. After the destruction of the cathedral, the tombstone was lost, but it was found in 1859, and is now in the Palais des Beaux-Arts Museum in Lille. Music and influence. Du Fay composed in most of the common forms of the day, including masses, motets, magnificats, hymns, simple chant settings in Fosbourden, and antiphons within the area of sacred music, and rondo, ballades, varlets, and a few other chanson types within the realm of secular music. None of his surviving music is specifically instrumental, although instruments were certainly used for some of his secular music, especially for the lower parts. All of his sacred music is vocal. Instruments may have been used to reinforce the voices in actual performance for almost any of his works. 7 complete masses, 28 individual mass movements, 15 settings of chant used in mass propers, 3 magnificats, 2 benedicamus domino settings, 15 antiphon settings, 27 hymns, 22 motets and 87 chansons definitely by him have survived. Chant settings and Fosbourden. Many of Du Fay's compositions were simple settings of chant, obviously designed for liturgical use, probably as substitutes for the unadorned chant, and can be seen as chant harmonizations. Often the harmonization used a technique of parallel writing known as Fosbourden, as in the following example, a setting of the Marian antiphon Avenue Maris Stella. Du Fay may have been the first composer to use the term Fosbourden for this simply compositional style, prominent in 15th-century liturgical music in general and that of the Burgundian School in particular. Secular music. Most of Du Fay's secular songs follow the formes fixes, which dominated secular European music of the 14th and 15th centuries. He also wrote a handful of Italian ballad, almost certainly while he was in Italy. As is the case with his motets, many of the songs were written for specific occasions, and many are datable, thus supplying useful biographical information. Most of his songs are for 3 voices, using a texture dominated by the highest voice. The other 2 voices, unsupplied with text, were probably played by instruments. Occasionally Du Fay used 4 voices, but in a number of these songs the 4th voice was supplied by a later, usually anonymous, composer. Typically he used the rondo form when writing love songs. His latest secular songs show influence from Busnoy and Ockham, and the rhythmic and melodic differentiation between the voices is less, as in the work of other composers of the mid-15th century. He was beginning to tend towards the smooth polyphony which was to become the predominant style 50 years later. A typical ballad is Rasveles-vous et Fayt's Chieli, which was written in 1423 for the marriage of Carlo Malatesta and Vittoria di Lorenzo Colonna. The musical form is AABC for each stanza, with C being the refrain. The musical setting emphasizes passages in the text which specifically refer to the couple being married. Writings on music theory. 2 written works by Du Fay have been documented, but neither has survived. A note in the margin in a manuscript held in the Biblioteca Palatina in Parma refers to a musica which he wrote. No copy of the work itself has been found. 19th-century musicologist François-Joseph Fayt is claimed to have seen a 16th-century copy of a Tractatus de Musica Mensurata Ada Proportionibus by Du Fay, last documented as having been sold to a London book dealer in 1824. The contents of neither work are known. Influence. Dufay was one of the last composers to make use of late medieval polyphonic structural techniques such as isorhythm, and one of the first to employ the more mellifluous harmonies, phrasing and melodies characteristic of the early Renaissance. His compositions within the larger genres are mostly similar to each other. His renown is largely due to what was perceived as his perfect control of the forms in which he worked, as well as his gift for memorable and singable melody. During the 15th century he was universally regarded as the greatest composer of his time, an opinion that has largely survived to the present day. The early music ensemble Dufay Collective is named after him. Sound samples. Ecclesia Militant is performed by Blue Heron Renaissance Choir. Right Major M performed by Blue Heron Renaissance Choir.